Cooper with CFIN, and today I'm here with Glenford Jameson, who is a food lawyer and principal of G.S. Jameson and Company. And today we're going to be continuing our conversation on regulations in Canada covering cellular food. Hi, Glenford. How are you?
Hey, I'm great, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
Great. So we'll just jump in here and talk about cellular food again. And first of all, maybe you can talk about some of the concerns around creating regulations or having coverage that covers things like food safety and consistent quality and food labeling and naming, things like that that people are concerned about cellular food.
Uh, yeah, sure. So, I mean, the concerns kind of go from the origins of the product all the way and through how it's marketed. And not only consumers are concerned, but certainly market competitors are concerned and innovators are concerned. And I mean, notionally, something like cell ag, if it can be scaled, would have and was uptaken by consumers would have a massive impact on the way that we use our world, right? Like that's kind of like the most attractive part of this discussion is from an environmental perspective and a land use perspective and a sustainability perspective.
Right.
There's a lot of potential upside here. In terms of concerns, I mean, like all of this is somewhat conceptual right now, right? Keep in mind that like in Singapore, yes, there is legal cell-derived or printed meat that's for sale on the market. But that's the only jurisdiction in the world. And there are a few others that are really aggressively figuring out how to think about this and how to govern it and how to sort of work with it. Israel, sort of on the top of the pile. The United States, the FDA has recently come out with sort of a consultation process and an initial sort of a blessing, but certainly contemplation of what cell ag might look like. So we're very early in this process. And so a lot of the concerns are not necessarily based in fact or reality, but are certainly based in concept, right? And so you think about why our food system works right now. And I'm sure many of your viewers are going to say our food system doesn't work right now, but for the meat that comes to our supermarkets, it's heavily regulated and it's understood, right? It's comfortable insofar as that we know how to rear hogs and we know how to rear cattle and we know how to rear poultry and by and large, we understand how to do that in a safe way and in a way that is more or less ethical and at least sort of aligned with a series of laws and acts relating to the transport of those animals, the feed and the water and the rest that they get, and how to rear them and how to process them, how to bring them to market. And so the notion of cell agriculture challenges most of that, right? Because we sort of we opt out of most of those steps and we end up with meat that hypothetically will be sold in a supermarket at some point. So what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is we don't truly understand, at least the public doesn't truly understand, how that meat is going to be created, what kind of cell media is going to be used, whether that may possess any problems or concerns at a health level in comparison to sort of like the tried and true, beef,
right.
pork, poultry, that sort of thing. So there's a question mark there. And you may say like, well, like what gives? Like, who cares? But you think about the consumer's relationship to food, and it's often fraught with, a significant degree of concern. I don't think that any of us are spending that much time anymore on genetically modified organisms or GE issues. It seems like that's kind of been settled. But for the better part of our lives, there have been grave concerns over whether your food was genetically modified or not. And the move away from something called atomic mutagenesis, which is or selective breeding practices, which is how we used to change seeds for traits that we liked, to a more surgical process, was really fraught with tension between industry, various industry actors, and consumers and consumer groups, and that sort of thing. And that continues, right? Health Canada and CFIA just put out a policy on the use of CRISPR, Cas, and gene editing techniques in novel foods, and how to think about true gene editing as opposed to classic GMOs. And so, in the same way, there are concerns from the consumer. You think about food, and it's so easy to think about it as simply as like a functional process of getting nutrition to your plate. Um, but you think about conflict, you think about change, you think about instability. Like food really is something that should be enshrined in the concept of public safety,
Mm.
right? And you also think about sort of in our recent history, and like the best way to think about going forward, student of history, is to think about sort of what have we gone through. We think about the BSE crisis that we
Mm.
experienced in Canada in the 2000s, which led to great challenges for Canadians trying to access the U.S. market, the beef industry, and really like a great deal of hardship for a lot of farmers, a lot of processors and folks in the industry. And that stemmed from a prion, and so a folded protein that just kind of exists and happened to get into our food supply and is sufficiently terrifying to clamp down the border and then to create new legislation in the U.S. relating to country of origin labeling. The reason why that response was so strong was because the outcome of a potential prion getting into the food system is so grave
Mm-hmm.
that this was sufficient to sort of warrant those actions. And so some of the questions you think about with cellular agriculture is, well, what protections are there in place to prevent the same sort of thing? Like if we're printing those proteins, we're printing cells, how do we prevent good faith actors creating an error, right? And the answer to that isn't necessarily clear right now. And perhaps industry would say, or those who are in cellular agriculture would say, like, look, like you cannot, like, there's no way to create something like really malignant in a good faith processing facility for cellular agriculture. Conversely, what if there is someone who is seeking to sort of disturb a meat
Mm.
supply, for example,
Right.
right? And or maybe there's a defect in cell media, uh, right? Sort of like the underlying piece that the product is built upon. Um, then how do we govern that? How do we think about it? And so in Canada, we've got a single regulator. So we've got the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. They do enforcement, inspections, that sort of thing. And they oversee a number of acts, going from feeds and seeds and fertilizers all the way to the Safe Food for Canadians Act and Food and Drugs Act, which oversees labeling issues, standard of identity, and those sorts of things. So in the same way of like there are concerns with cellular agriculture that sort of go from production all the way to your fork, CFIA sort of oversees like the same number of things. And they have a number of different acts and regulations that are specific to these processes. And so I would say, at some point, there may be regulations or laws that are created specifically to deal with cellular agriculture. But in the near term, much like what we talked about in our first video, the primary place from which CFIA and Health Canada are going to draw from is this novel foods process, which is
Mm-hmm.
set out in the food and drug regulations. And the novel foods piece involves the first step, which is a determination of novelty. And if something's not novel, then you can sell it, and you have obligations as a producer to make sure that it's safe and clean, will not contain deleterious substances, and not be manufactured in a place that is unsanitary, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if it is novel, then we go through a pre-market safety assessment. That pre-market safety assessment is a big deal. Like it takes some time. It's supposed to not
Mm-hmm.
take that much time. TFI is working on making it a little bit more efficient because it's a genuinely unpleasant process to go through. It's no picnic. But through that process, uh, uh, scientists and experts at Health Canada will challenge the producer of a novel food to ensure that that food is safe in Canada, and that may involve questions around toxicology, and it may involve questions surrounding, dietary factors, nutritive factors, any number of things. Whether the proteins or the macronutrients are bioavailable, right? Like there are any number of questions, and so that's a serious process. So in Canada, in terms of like what are we concerned about? It's like, well, we're concerned about a number of things, both from the consumer's perspective, who are entitled to a process that they can trust, because they're unable, ultimately, like if cellular agriculture comes together, they'll be unable to tell whether something came from cattle or came from a lab, right? So consumer protection and trust in the regulator and rigorous processes is really important, both for the industry to ensure uptake and from the consumer's perspective for protection. But from industry, I mean, what you kind of want to work through these problems is a process that is transparent, is clear, and that sets out timelines and expectations and meets them. And that's a big problem that CFI is sort of acknowledged and is working on. But really, in terms of concerns, I mean, there are a number of concerns stemming from what we just talked about, all the way to sort of how do you label this stuff, and so we've got a framework in place to deal with those things. We may see that change over time, but that's certainly those are how we're thinking about this right now within Canada.
So it sounds like definitely we'll see some labeling changes. Can you comment on that? Because that's a huge thing. What are we going to name these products?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what we're seeing globally is really interesting, right? And that we're sort of seeing a race to become a knowledge center as relates to cellular agriculture, right? And so you see Singapore as a global center for plant-based and cellular agriculture, so plant-based proteins, cellular agriculture. I mean, this makes sense for a bunch of reasons. I mean, Singapore is a city state, right? It doesn't have any agricultural lands. And so that's interesting. But practically speaking, what they're seeking to do is to create a knowledge center and to create a center that wields some power and authority in terms of how to answer these questions before anyone else can, in the hope that it carries sufficient weight to have others sort of follow suit. And we're also seeing, particularly in Asian countries, groupings of countries coming together to come to an agreement over whether we're going to call stuff plant-based or sell egg or what, right? Cultured food, who knows? And then the idea from an economic perspective, not that dissimilar to what CFIN is trying to do, is like you create innovators, you increase the economy, it becomes a knowledge center, and then people come to Singapore to try and figure out how to bring this technology to their own country, right? And so in that way, Canada, I don't think is ever really going to be a true leader. I see Canada just from a macroeconomic perspective. It's like we make a lot of food in this country, right? And in a very traditional way. So it's going to be very difficult from a political perspective.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Hey, you know what? Like, sorry, all you beef farmers, like this is the future, and you can all, turn your farms into hobby farms and or like find a way to switch to canola. I don't know. And so that seems unlikely to me. But there are leaders around the world that are trying to figure this stuff out. And I think Canada is like not like a Luddite in this conversation. Like there are universities and knowledge centers that are working on this. There are incredible investors and incredible innovators who are based from Canada working in this area. We've met a bunch of them, and they're really impressive. Our proximity to the U.S. is great. But that being said, I think that like this is not the job on the top of the pile from the federal government standpoint. And so determining what we're going to call this stuff, I think we're going to sort of wait and see. This is like all speculation. We're going to sort of wait and see what resonates with consumers and governments worldwide. Canada, we have foods that have standards of identity, right? So we've got foods that, so if you say something like meat patty, a meat patty has a definition in two different eggs, right? And we have to meet that definition to call it a meat patty. If we don't have enough meat protein in it, how much, 17, 19%, who knows? Then you can't call it that. And CFIA can, pull your packages, have you repackage the stuff, or engage in some sort of enforcement action. So there's that. For unstandardized foods, we're always trying to figure out, does the consumer really understand what you're selling with an unstandardized food, right? So for whiskey and meat patties and those sorts of things, milk, cheeses, those are all defined. But for things that sit outside of that, they're not defined. And so a big part of that is like, is this going to be confusing to the consumer? It's something that's been really interesting in Canada to see is that the perspective of the regulator of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency as relates to plant-based products, for example, has really changed as the consumer has changed. So 10 years ago, before most of us were engaging or being offered plant-based products in lieu of cheese or butter or
Mm-hmm.
milk. Now it's like an everyday thing. And so if you say to someone like, "What is oat milk?" Or what is almond milk, that sort of thing, the
Mm-hmm.
average consumer is going to kind of understand, right? What is cashew cheese? Like, I have a very good idea
Mm-hmm.
what.
Right.
I think most Canadians kind of do, whereas like 15 years ago, it's not the case. So in Canada, like there is from a nomenclature perspective, like how are we going to call this stuff what it is from a cell and for cell ag, specifically for cell ag. I think that like kind of a wait and see approach is
Mm-hmm.
probably what we're going to see from our regulators, and that'll give sort of time for these products to become more established. Again, like this is all subject to someone sort of unlocking like that magic code of being able to scale this stuff, right? So what we've
Mm-hmm.
seen so far as I know, is like yes, we can do this. We cannot do this affordably, and we cannot necessarily do this at scale yet, and we're figuring that out. So assuming we get there, then I think we're going to see consumers sort of figuring out what best to call this. The
Mm-hmm.
regulator will always have a hand in it, and as I said earlier, this is going to be a hot button issue from a political perspective because of the interests involved, right? But I think that yeah, we're sort of going to see as Canadians, we're not going to be leading this conversation.
Mm-hmm. So it also sounds like the laws in Canada are going to be tweaked as more products go through that novel food process and try to come to market as well.
Yeah, maybe. Like the thought for me is, I, as a starting position, and as someone who works typically with regulated parties, my sense is that we've got lots of laws.
Mm.
I don't know if we need
We don't
more
need
per
more.
se. We have a hard enough time enforcing the laws that we have in a consistent, fair manner. And so you think about the laws and regulations that we have, and it's like, so we have a system to deal with novelty and novel foods, and we have a system to deal with safety and
Hmm.
determining whether a food is safe or not. And so if those processes can give industry sufficient clarity, then that probably gets you most of the way there, and the early stages at least. And then at some point, sort of in the stage of an industry or an idea, when we move away from like true freewheeling innovation and head into a more standardized process, that's when you can start to expect consultations over a cellular meat act, right? That might set out like
Okay.
here are the critical controls that we expect in a meat plant. Here are the critical controls that we expect in a cellular meat plant.
Right.
Uh,
Okay.
Here are the accepted inputs for this specific process. Here's how we receive additives and how additives might be added to this, and sort of making more clear what that process looks like. I mean, the entire food industry is based on these notions of good manufacturing processes,
Hmm.
GMPs, right? So we talk about GMPs all the time. Most of the time, I don't think we actually know what we're talking about when we say GMPs. It's sort of it's like,
It's
well,
a
like
vague idea.
no one's sort of yelling at you, and that's
Right.
great. And like I'll get yelled at because like there's the GFSI exists out there, and there are a number of certifying bodies that actually set forth what GMPs are. But like what doesn't exist right now for cellular agriculture is any GMPs, right? We're somewhere between really smart entrepreneurs and totally mad scientists trying to figure out like what's the best way to do this to make sure that we get the right texture and the right number of like the right fat to protein ratio and the
Hmm.
right taste while being able to actually access the media that we need to build these things. And then how do we take that and then sort of expand it out, right? And so once those things are figured out and you're able to really scale this stuff, then you're going to start to see GMPs being created. And you know what? For all
Right.
I know, within industry associations right now, that's probably a conversation that's being had is like, well, what might GMPs look like for this
Hmm.
industry? Like, what are
Okay.
critical problems that we might have in scaling this up, so that when an inspector shows up and they say like, look, like you're creating rotting flesh because it's never lived, and as soon as it's done printing, it's kind of on a
Mm.
it's like ready for market. So
Mm-hmm.
and it's subject not only to external food safety or food safety issues or foodborne illnesses that can create colony forming units on a piece of meat, just like regular meat. It's like we also have to worry about the 50 to 200 inputs that you're putting in here to make sure that they're of a certain quality and standard.
Right.
And maybe they weren't necessarily designed for food in the first place.
Mm.
Maybe, and so how do we make sure that all of those media are aligned? I really hope that I get yelled at for this video because there are going to be folks who live in labs who I know, and they're going to say like, absolutely everything that we use is food grade, you maniac. Like, don't put that mind in people's heads. But the regulator won't know that. So that's going to be a question they're going to have. And
Mm-hmm.
so finding a way to say, like, here's the good manufacturing process for this
Right.
is going to be sort of the step that we get to before
And
we
also
see any real
having
regulatory changes.
a structure that newer companies can follow once those companies have scaled their product and brought them to market. So yeah,
Well,
so
and like that's an even bigger question, right? And like kind of the
yeah.
fun part of this is like, and I'm going to date myself here and say like, we are in the VHS versus Betamax sort of universe, right? It's like there are a
Right.
number of different ways to store media, and we don't know if it's going to be either of those things, and then presumably one or more will become sort of like dominant manners of printing media or
Mm-hmm.
sort of doing cell-based ag.
Mm-hmm.
But in this moment, there are an infinite number of them. There's as many as
Right.
there are people who are trying to do this. And so that's exciting, but it's also that makes it really difficult to try and think about what would regulations look like? Like how would we
Mm-hmm.
regulate the production of this thing when everyone is working on their own methods? It's much easier to say like, this is what a pasture looks like, and this is what a meat processing facility or abattoir looks like, and here's our expectation, and here's how fast the line moves, and here's like how many seconds you take to inspect a hide versus
Mm-hmm.
just this is what we've developed. We think there's a great way to create sustainable proteins that can like help save our carbon crisis and feed Canadians and give vegans ethical meat. Like how what an extraordinary thing. It's a very different
Mm-hmm.
conversation from a
Mm-hmm.
food safety perspective, from a regulatory perspective.
Right. Is there anything else that you wanted to add in terms of what we should be looking for, if anything, at this point, in terms of new regulations or changes?
Um, like in terms of what we're looking for, like I think that the best for those who are in this industry, the best thing you can do is sort of look backwards. So when I think about cell ag, the best touchstone that I have is in the mid to late 2000s. Um, High pressure processing became a
Right.
thing,
Yeah.
right? HPP, big thing, and initially it was received with the status of novelty in Canada.
Mm.
We weren't really sure how to regulate it, and it's like a gnarly process for the first few HPP products that went through it. But eventually, Health Canada and CFIA sort of put their heads together and said, "Look, like all of these things seem to share a process that we can kind of understand. So let's create guidelines for how to assess novelty in the context of high or of HPP foods."
Right.
Uh, and so my thought with Cell Ag, and like when we're seeing this guidance being developed right now, or at least initial guidance being developed, is allowing industry to have transparency and sort of managing industry's expectations and saying like, look, like we're not just like guessing when you give us a novelty submission. Like here's what we're thinking about before you prepare your novelty submission. Here's what we're worried about. Here's what we're comfortable with, and if you don't fit within this, then like we're going to need to see more things here, here, and here.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably going to skew novel if you don't hit these sort of boxes. And if you do, then you probably don't. So you can take that to your investors, you can take that to your supply chain, you can sort of model around that, as opposed to being worried about being caught up in a pre-market safety assessment that could take a couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So and then for others who are engaged in this industry, as I said, and like I don't say it as a negative thing. Like I love this country. I don't think Canada is going to be a leader in this area. The FDA is engaged. I think the FDA had a really hard time dealing with plant-based milks primarily,
Right.
and was sort of slow to respond to the development of oat, almond, and soy milks, and now has sort of looked at that experience where a number of times court cases had to be brought to refer matters to FDA to get them to sort of give a court direction.
Right.
Now they're getting ahead of this, and that's something that's really positive. The other thing that's really neat is that this market sector exists. Not so ag
Hmm.
necessarily, but certainly plant based. And
Right.
plant based gives a home and a voice to ethical vegans, to those that are concerned about climate and carbon. And so we see organizations like the Good Food Institute,
Hmm.
for whom we're recommended counsel. And we look at the work that they do in advocacy and in assisting organizations in the United States. And I think that's extraordinary. And so we think about, what it was like to create a plant-based product 10 years ago
Hmm.
versus what it's like now. The resources and the communities that are created now are really wildly different. And so you don't feel like you're the first one through the wall, which is never a comfortable experience. There's a community, and you're competing, but at least there's an industry and an association surrounding that. And I think
Right.
that's really interesting.
Right.
So
And that's what we're building here in Canada as well in the next couple of years, hopefully. A community of,
absolutely,
cell food producers.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the hope, right? Is to
Right.
foster that innovation here. Um, it's funny. I'm slagging on Canada a lot here, but it is an amazing marketplace. Its proximity to the U.S. is great. Its ability, we find clients often like coming to Canada when they're from Asia or Europe before heading into
Hmm.
the U.S., because this is almost like a great proof of concept in Canada before they head to
Right.
the U.S. Right? It's like similar in income, similar in taste to many Americans. And so if you can do it here, you can do it there. Whereas I
Mm.
hear like there's less civil liability, and
Hmm.
it's sort of often an easier market to break into.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks for your views today, Glenford. It was great talking to you as usual.
Thanks, Carolyn. Thanks for having me.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Take care.